Welcome back to the Begin Purpose podcast. In our last episode, we talked about protecting purpose in a noisy life. We explored how attention, comparison, digital noise, overcommitment, emotional clutter, and constant urgency can pull us away from what matters. We talked about the need to protect the space where purpose can grow, because not everything that demands our attention deserves our direction. Today, I want to continue that journey by talking about what happens when we begin to change internally, but the old version of ourselves still tries to come along. This episode is called Living from a Renewed Identity, because one of the hardest parts of transformation is not simply beginning something new. It is learning how to stop returning to the identity that no longer fits. Many people assume that once they have clarity, the old patterns will automatically disappear. They believe that once they recognize what matters, once they understand their values, once they name their purpose, once they decide to begin again, everything inside them will line up and cooperate. But anyone who has tried to grow knows it is not usually that simple. You can have a powerful realization and still feel pulled toward an old reaction. You can decide to live with purpose and still drift into avoidance. You can know you are becoming someone new and still hear the old voice whisper, "This is not who you are. You will go back. You always do." That is why renewed identity matters. A renewed identity is not a temporary mood. It's not a weekend burst of motivation. It's not the feeling we get after listening to something inspiring. A renewed identity is the gradual, intentional process of learning to live from a truer version of yourself, even while the old version still feels familiar. Familiarity is powerful. We often underestimate it. Sometimes the old identity does not feel good, but it feels known. A person may not like being anxious, reactive, invisible, overextended, resentful, self-critical, or stuck, but they may know how to live there. They know the emotional furniture of that room. They know where everything is. They know what to expect. A renewed identity, even if it is healthier, can feel unfamiliar at first. It can feel awkward to speak up if you have always stayed silent. It can feel selfish to rest if your worth has been tied to being useful. It can feel risky to create if you have built your life around avoiding criticism. It can feel strange to hope if disappointment has trained you to expect less. This is why some people return to old patterns, not because the old patterns are better, but because the old patterns are familiar. The nervous system often prefers familiar discomfort over unfamiliar freedom. That may sound strange, but many of us have lived it. We say we want peace, but we keep recreating urgency. We say we want confidence, but we keep rehearsing self-doubt. We say we want purpose, but we keep filling life with distractions that protect us from the vulnerability of beginning. We say we want to change, but when change starts asking us to live differently, the old identity begins negotiating. The old identity says, "Stay where you know the rules." The renewed identity says, "Step into the life that reflects who you are becoming." That tension is part of the process. In earlier episodes, we asked the question, "Who are you today?" That question remains central here because renewed identity is practiced daily. It is not enough to announce, "I am different now," if the daily choices continue to reinforce the old story. Identity becomes believable through evidence. Every time you act in alignment with who you are becoming, you give the renewed identity another piece of proof. Every time you return after drifting, you prove that the old pattern no longer has the final word. Every time you speak differently, choose differently, respond differently, or show up differently, you are not just changing behavior. You are practicing a new self-understanding. This does not mean you will feel like the renewed person immediately. In fact, you may feel like an imposter at first. A person learning to set boundaries may feel rude. A person learning to lead may feel unqualified. A person learning to rest may feel lazy. A person learning to be visible may feel exposed. A person learning to receive love may feel suspicious. A person learning to live with purpose may feel foolish for believing their life could carry more meaning. These feelings do not necessarily mean you are doing something wrong. Sometimes they mean you are practicing an identity your old self does not yet recognize. That is why we need patience with ourselves in the identity process. We are not machines being reprogrammed instantly. We are people carrying history, habits, body memory, emotional reflexes, relationships, and old interpretations. Renewal is real, but it is also practiced. It takes repetition. It takes grace. It takes honesty. It takes a willingness to recognize when the old identity is trying to retake the wheel. One of the clearest signs that an old identity is active is the phrase, I always. I always mess this up. I always quit. I always overthink. I always get overlooked. I always choose the wrong thing. I always fall back. Another sign is, I never finish. I never know what I want. I never follow through. I never get chosen. I never change. These phrases feel factual because they are familiar, but often they are not facts. They are old verdicts, pretending to be truth. A renewed identity begins to challenge those verdicts, not with fake positivity, but with a more honest sentence. Instead of I always quit, the renewed identity might say, I have quit before when I felt overwhelmed, but I am learning how to return. Instead of I never follow through, it might say, I have struggled with consistency, but I can keep one promise today. Instead of I am not the kind of person who does this, it might say, I may be new at this, but I am becoming someone who practices it. That shift may seem small, but language is a doorway. The words we repeat shape the choices we believe are available. Renewed identity also requires us to stop confusing history with destiny. Your past may explain why certain things are difficult for you. It may explain why you protect yourself, avoid conflict, expect rejection, distrust success, or overwork to prove worth. But explanation is not the same as final definition. It does not have to become the permanent author of your life. A mistake may explain a lesson. It does not have to become your name. A season may explain where you have been. It does not have to decide who you are allowed to become. This is one of the most important truths in the Begin Purpose journey. You can honor the reality of your story without handing your future over to it. A renewed identity does not deny the past. It integrates the past. It says, yes, that happened. Yes, I lived that. Yes, I learned certain patterns. Yes, I carried certain pain. But I am not required to keep living as though that chapter is the whole book. That is not denial. That is authorship. Sometimes living from a renewed identity also changes relationships, and that can be uncomfortable. People who knew the old version of you may not immediately understand the new one. If you were always available, they may not understand your boundaries. If you were always quiet, they may be surprised by your voice. If you were always the fixer, they may resist your refusal to carry everything. If you were always self-deprecating, they may not know what to do with your confidence. If you were always drifting, they may not trust your new direction at first. This does not mean everyone around you is against your growth. Sometimes people simply need time to adjust. But it does mean that renewed identity must be strong enough to withstand other people's discomfort. If your growth depends on everyone immediately approving it, then your old identity will remain easy to access. Many people return to the old self because the old self kept others comfortable. But purpose may require you to lovingly disappoint the expectations that depended on your disconnection. That can be hard, especially if you have built your identity around being liked, needed, agreeable, or predictable. But a meaningful life cannot be built entirely around keeping others comfortable with a version of you that no longer reflects truth. There is a difference between being kind and being trapped. There is a difference between loving people and letting their expectations decide your identity. A renewed identity asks, what is truthful now? Not, what role have I always played? Not, what version of me is easiest for others? Not, what identity avoids the most conflict? What is truthful now? For some, the truthful answer may be, I am no longer available for relationships that require me to disappear. For others, it may be, I am no longer willing to call fear wisdom. For someone else, it may be, I am no longer going to treat my own purpose as optional. Or, I am no longer going to speak about myself with contempt. Or, I am no longer going to live as though it is too late. These are not arrogant statements. They are alignment statements. They are ways of saying, I am practicing a renewed identity, and I am choosing to live from it. But let's be honest, there will be days when the old identity feels louder. There will be days when you react instead of respond. Days when you avoid instead of act. Days when you shrink instead of speak. Days when you forget what you said mattered. This is where the renewed identity must include the ability to return. If renewal depends on perfection, it will collapse quickly. But if renewal includes return, it becomes sustainable. The old identity says, you failed, so this proves nothing changed. The renewed identity says, I drifted, and now I return. The old identity says, you missed a day, so you are back at zero. The renewed identity says, I still have the wisdom I have gained, and I can take the next step. The old identity says, you are a hypocrite for struggling. The renewed identity says, I am human, and practice includes imperfect days. That difference is enormous. Shame wants to turn every stumble into an identity crisis. Purpose turns every stumble into a return point. A practical way to strengthen renewed identity is to create what I call identity evidence. Identity evidence is a small, concrete action that supports the person you are becoming. If you are becoming more courageous, identity evidence may be one honest conversation. If you are becoming more disciplined, it may be one kept promise. If you are becoming more peaceful, it may be choosing not to enter an unnecessary argument. If you are becoming more creative, it may be 30 minutes of making something. If you are becoming more aligned, it may be saying no to what does not fit this season. The action does not have to be huge, it simply has to be real. Over time, these small actions accumulate. They become evidence your mind can no longer ignore. You begin to think, maybe I am becoming someone different. Not because you shouted it loudly enough, but because you lived it often enough. This is why tiny choices matter so much. A renewed identity is not only formed in dramatic decisions, it is formed in repeated alignment. The person who wants to become healthier practices health in one meal, one walk, one appointment, one bedtime, one act of care. The person who wants to become more honest practices honesty in one sentence, one confession, one conversation, one refusal to hide. The person who wants to become purposeful practices purpose in one meaningful action, one protected hour, one step toward what matters. We often want the new identity to feel complete before we act from it. But usually, we act from it before it feels complete. We put on the behavior of the person we are becoming, and eventually, the identity becomes less foreign. This is not pretending, it is practicing. A musician practices before feeling mastery. A leader practices leadership before feeling fully confident. A person healing from old patterns practices the new response before it feels natural. Practice is how the renewed identity becomes embodied. There is also a need to grieve the old identity sometimes. That may sound surprising, especially if the old identity caused pain. But even painful identities can become attached to a sense of safety, belonging, or predictability. If you were always the strong one, letting go of that role may feel like losing significance. If you were always the funny one who hid pain behind humor, becoming more honest may feel exposed. If you were always the helper, setting boundaries may feel like losing your place. If you were always the person who expected little, allowing hope may feel vulnerable. Renewal may require grieving what the old identity gave you, even as you recognize what it cost you. That grief deserves gentleness. We do not have to hate the old self in order to become renewed. In many cases, the old self was trying to protect us. The old self learned patterns that may have helped us survive, belong, avoid pain, or navigate difficult seasons. Thank you for getting me here, but you cannot lead me there. You are allowed to outgrow the strategy that once kept you safe. What old identity do you keep returning to? And what renewed identity are you being invited to practice? What evidence can you create today? One action, one act of courage. One visible sign that the renewed identity is no longer just an idea. Do not wait until you feel completely different. Practice the identity in the next moment available to you. That is how renewal becomes real. Living from a renewed identity does not mean you never hear the old story again. It means the old story no longer gets final authority. It means you recognize the familiar pull, but choose the aligned step. It means you stop treating the old version of yourself as the most accurate version. It means you allow who you are becoming to become more believable through repeated action. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Begin Purpose podcast. In our next episode, we will continue this journey by exploring how purpose matures over time and why the life you are building may require not only a new beginning, but a deeper commitment to becoming someone who can carry it well. Until then, remember this: you are not required to keep living from an identity that no longer tells the truth. You can practice renewal. You can create evidence. You can return. You can become. This is Begin Purpose, and today is a good day to live from the person you are becoming.